Good evening, everyone, and welcome. Thank you so much for joining us for a night of learning and conversation. Tonight, Rabbi Buchdahl will speak with Dr. Beverly Daniel Tatum. Dr. Tatum is a nationally renowned voice and expert on issues of race, identity, and education in America. Dr. Tatum is the author of several books, including Why Are All the Black Kids Sitting Together in the Cafeteria and Other Conversations About Race. Originally published in 1997 to much acclaim, this classic work was back on the New York Times bestseller list in July of 2020. A world-class educator and professor, Dr. Tatum taught in the psychology department of Mount Holyoke College for many years and also served as Mount Holyoke's acting president. From 2002 to 2015, Dr. Tatum went on to serve as the 9th president of Spelman College. In 2013, the Carnegie Corporation of New York named Dr. Tatum as a recipient of its 2013 Academic Leadership Award, recognizing her as an exceptional president of a U.S. college or university. She was the first president in the state of Georgia and the first at an historically Black college or university to win that award. Dr. Tatum, on behalf of all of us at Central, it is my absolute honor to welcome you to our community. Thank you so much for being here.
Oh, I'm delighted. Thank you very much.
I'll join in and just say that we are truly honored to have you and to learn from you. I think when we had the chance to meet before this conversation, we talked about the fact that we are really on a journey of continuing this conversation about race that is certainly not starting tonight, but is going to be deepened with our learning with you tonight, and will continue beyond here. And to bring your particular perspective is such a gift. I think to get us all kind of invested and kind of engaged in the conversation, if you would open with a thought exercise for us to kind of help us enter into this space, would be great.
It would be my pleasure to do that. So thank you so much, Rabbi Buchdahl. And let me just start by saying I'm pleased to be here and thank everyone who's tuning in to be part of this conversation. I do like to start by asking my audiences to take a moment and think about their own earliest race-related experience. I can't see the, almost 90 people who are on this call, but I know that if we were all in a room together and I were to ask how many of you have thought of something going back to your childhood, most people would have their hands raised. And if I were to then ask, how old were you at the time of your experience, that thing you have recalled, how old were you? 4, 5, 6, 8, 10, 15, 25. The answers will vary depending on where you grew up and what your background, your life experience has been so far. But my guess is if we were doing an online survey, we might find that most people would say somewhere between 5 and 8, typically early elementary school age. Most people will think of something that maybe happened in school or on the playground or something like that. Some people, of course, will say, not till I got to college, or maybe, when I went into the military, or who knows, depending on their previous life experience. But it's very common for someone to have an early elementary school age experience. And then I might ask, what emotion is attached to this memory you have? What was the feeling that you felt at the time of your experience? Some people will say happiness, love, friendship, because it's associated with a warm feeling. But most people will express some discomfort. Maybe it's the discomfort of confusion or anxiety or embarrassment or shame or fear or sadness or guilt. Those aren't, of course, the only words someone might remember, but they're very common. And most people will tell you that, some version of one of those words was the emotion that they felt at the time. I'd then like to ask, did you have a conversation with anyone about your experience? A parent, a teacher, some other concerned adult? If I could ask people for a show of hands, which of course I can't see, but if I could, I would ask people to raise their hands if they did have such a conversation. There are always some people who will say they did. but most people will say they did not. And I think that's really interesting, particularly if you're one of those people who has, let's say, a 6-year-old memory, something that happened when you were 6, and it caused some discomfort. And here, decades later, you still can remember it. And yet you didn't talk to anyone about it at the time that it occurred. What's interesting to me about that, as a psychologist who has studied child development and has a lot of experience with children, including my own, I know 6-year-olds and 7-year-olds and 5-year-olds are pretty chatty. They tend to blurt out stuff. And so if we have a substantial portion of the audience who has an early memory and didn't talk about it, it does beg the question, why not? If we were all together in the same room, I would be asking that question. And some people might say, well, maybe it was because it was the parent or the teacher who said the thing or caused the confusion. Maybe there wasn't the person to ask because the person I would ordinarily ask was the person who did or said the thing that was upsetting. But even if that's not the case, for a lot of people, the answer really is, I just knew I wasn't supposed to. The adults in the environment somehow had communicated to me that I wasn't supposed to talk about this, that this was a topic that made these kinds of experiences, these kinds of issues made adults uncomfortable. And because they were uncomfortable, it was better not to bring it up, or I might get in trouble for bringing it up. It's hard to imagine what people are thinking without being able to see them. But I've done this so many times that I know that typically this is when people are nodding their heads and saying, yeah, that was true for me. I did get that message that I wasn't supposed to talk about it. I like to start any conversation I'm having about race or racism with an audience like we are this evening with just this thought experiment, because it signals, I think, to all of us, we all have some experience with the topic. Almost everyone will have remembered something. So even if you think this topic hasn't impacted you or it's not connected to your life experience, the truth is you just might not be remembering what the ways in which it has connected, because most people do remember something. And we all, I think, find it hard sometimes to talk about it. It is what we might call a toxic subject in our society. So here we are going to have a conversation about it. So it makes sense for us to just put on the table that it causes discomfort sometimes for many people. But you can't solve a problem without talking about it. So I'm delighted to be part of this conversation, and I appreciate the invitation to do so.
We are really excited to have it with you. And I'm certainly nodding along as I think about some of my earliest memories. So I think it's really intriguing. I want to actually first begin by thanking Rabbi Hilly Haber, not only for introducing you, but actually introducing you in the big way to our community by saying to me, we really should bring Dr. Tatum to Central, and what an amazing opportunity it is for us. And she really did so much of really almost all of the legwork with a team from Adult Engagement to bring you. And I'm so grateful for that. But she began with this sort of remarkable thought that you wrote a book over 20 years ago, which was a bestseller then. And I wondered if you were surprised that it actually got back on the bestseller list this July in light of all the conversations people have been having about race. And maybe even more importantly, what has changed since you wrote that book 23 years ago or published it 23 years ago? I mean, in what ways would you maybe encapsulate some of the progress we've made? And in what ways do you feel like things are the same or maybe even worse?
Yeah, well, so let me just put this a little bit in context. So when I wrote the book way back when, in the 90s, late 90s, I was working on it in 1996. It was published in 1997. At that time, I was a professor in psychology at Mount Holyoke and working with students and also doing lots of workshops with educators, K through 12 educators, principals, school superintendents. And it was because I was having those workshops with a lot of the same questions being asked over and over again that I decided I should write the book. So I really wrote it in that moment to share what I had learned, not just about what racism is, but how it impacts how young people think about themselves. And also, from the point of view of racial identity, and then also how we can break the silence about these issues to really problem solve. What can we do about racism? So fast forward to 2015, I was stepping down from my role at Spelman, having been president there for 13 years, getting ready to retire from that role, and thinking that I would like to return to my writing as my next project. And the publisher asked me to update this book, this Why Are All the Black Kids Sitting Together in the Cafeteria book. And so I did that for the 2017 release, which turns out to be the 20th anniversary of the original publication. So in working on that new version, I thought a lot about what was different. And in thinking about what was different, I wanted to have a prologue. My publisher, turned out the prologue was about 70 pages long. And the publisher said, prologues are usually kind of short, Beverly. But I had a lot to say because, in fact, there were a lot of things that had changed. And I often refer to the things that had changed as the 4 Ps. The first P being population. The demographics of our nation had changed significantly over those 20 years, certainly over my lifetime, and really starting to gain momentum in those last 20 years. And what do I mean by that? I was born in 1954. In 1954, the U.S. population was 90% white, European American, and 10% everybody else. All the groups that we think of as the BIPOC, Black, Indigenous, people of color, represented 10% of the total population. Fast forward to 2017, when my book was coming out, if we looked at the total population, the white population was not 90%, it was more like 66, 67%, 23% everybody else. But if you look at the young population in particular, those born in, let's say, the year 2000 and later, that population is barely 50% white. In fact, maybe more like 49% white. And so the shift in the demographics has been quite dramatic over, as I said, over my lifetime. And largely that is the result of immigration from non-European countries, from Africa, from Asia, from Central and South America. And also, of course, birth rates, but mostly the result of immigration. And so that's one change. The second P I talked about was politics. And in particular, the impact of political leadership. So during that 20-year period, we've had 4 presidents. And the first one was Bill Clinton. He was president in 1997, starting his second term. And he launched in 97, the same year my book came out, what he called his President's Initiative on Race. A lot of people don't remember this initiative. Unfortunately, the timing of it was such that it came shortly before the Monica Lewinsky scandal and got completely overlooked as a result of that. But when he launched it, one of the things he said was it was time for the nation to really confront its legacy of racism, and that it was important to do this then because we were at that time experiencing prosperity. We were a nation feeling prosperous, and we were also a nation at peace. We weren't at war with anyone. Fast forward to 2001, 4 years later, George W. Bush was the president, and he was still in his first year when 9/11 happened. And then we were no longer feeling like a nation at peace, right? We were feeling like a nation under threat. And we certainly saw a rise in anti-immigrant, particularly anti-Muslim rhetoric as a legacy of the 9/11 incident. during his time as well, President George W. Bush, at the end of his tenure, in the fall of 2008, before the November election, we experienced the collapse of the economy, right? The collapse of Wall Street. And so now not only are we not at peace, but we're not feeling prosperous either. And certainly there was no focused discussion about issues of racism during that time, except we did have the, election of President Barack Obama in 2008. And for many people, that marked a sign of progress. Look at this. The United States has elected its first Black president. But his election was followed by what I'm going to call a backlash, a rise in white supremacist activity almost immediately, and a lot of racist incidents leading up to his election. So on the one hand, there was a narrative that we were now post-racial, but in fact, we were experiencing pushback against that racial progress in the form of heightened activity among white supremacist groups. Fast forward to 2016, president number 4, of course, is our current president, Donald Trump. And we know as a fact that his campaign was very much layered with racial rhetoric, talking about immigrants in particular, negative comments about Mexicans, negative comments about Muslims, talking about a travel ban, etc. And all of these things leading to a lot of us-them thinking. The role of the leader is very important in terms of either bringing people together. We're all part of one group, one big, it's not red, not blue, but, the U.S. That was sort of the Obama rhetoric. The Trump rhetoric has been very much us and them in lots of different ways, us and them relative to journalism, us and them relative to, Democratic-led cities versus Republican-led cities, a lot of divisive language, and people follow the leader in terms of that. So when we look at race relations, we have to understand that the leader can bring people together or can emphasize division. So that was one thing. The third P, which is kind of connected to the second, is polarization. We've seen over the last 20 years a growing degree of polarization. Some of that due to political leadership, some of it, I think, due to just changes in our society. Social media, for example, has given people the freedom to get their news from lots of different sources. We don't all get it from the same nightly news that we're all watching at the same time. And so that has contributed to a sense of polarization. And then the fourth P is psychology. There are some things that we know today as a result of psychological research that we weren't talking about in 1997. All the research around unconscious bias, implicit bias, most of that research has been published in the years since 2000. Other concepts like microaggressions, have been popularized in this 21st century. So there's some ideas that are relevant to our interactions with each other that weren't really being talked about that I wanted to highlight in the book as well.
I think so powerful. One second, Will, right now I'm hearing a terrible echo, and Dr. Tatum, I'm hearing from you a lot of static. I was just going to say that to you, but now I can barely listen to myself because I'm hearing an echo. Is anyone else hearing that? Are you hearing that?
I'm not hearing static or an echo.
Okay. Yes, there's a very bad echo. Oh, I don't know what to do about that. Let me just turn myself off for 1 minute and see if it gets in. Oh, it went away. Oh, that's better. Fixed. But you're muted, so I'm afraid that when you go back on, that the echo might come back. We'll see what happens. So let me ask you the question, and then I'll turn myself off, and hopefully it will mean that it won't be a problem. There is.
I'm going to put on a headset and see if that helps.
Okay, that's great. And I'm going to invite you, if you don't mind. Well, actually, it's fine right now. Can you hear me, Dr. Tatum, when I ask you this question?
Yes, I can hear you.
Okay, Great. I think that made it better. I just want to make sure everyone can hear all the things you're saying, because it's
yeah.
rich and layered. Okay.
Okay, I can hear you. Can you hear me?
Yeah. I still hear a little
Perfect.
static, but I think it's okay. We're gonna we're gonna get past that. So
Okay.
I think there's a conversation about racism now, in particular around a sort of a binary that is kind of popularized maybe most strongly by Kendi in his book Being an Anti-Racist. Of you're either anti-racist, fighting racism, or you are a racist. And I probably don't. You talk about this in your book as well, that virtually no one besides maybe a white supremacist, but even they probably couch it in different terms as well. Nobody sees themselves as a racist, and certainly do not want to see themselves as racist. And I think that there is a sense that there's kind of a more rich way that you talk about racism. There's sort of the racism, which is prejudice, which maybe we'll all acknowledge we have in certain ways, but also that we fight against. And we certainly don't think that our prejudice usually reaches a level of racism or being a racist. But racism, you also define as prejudice coupled with power. And it's a much bigger, more macro issue of systems that kind of perpetuate differences and hierarchies. And so if you could just talk a little bit about what it means and how we might actually approach this, because I think that one of the things I've found is that there are ways to talk about polarization, that when we just call everything racism or call everyone racist, from a white supremacist to someone who's, maybe has a little more ignorance or just sort of is trying very hard and certainly doesn't have the same intention. How do we productively move through some of those definitions and help people recognize both what they need to recognize, maybe without lumping all of it together in one place, so that people can kind of also have some gradation of understanding that, and not just resist that term, but really try to grapple with it. And in particular, to grapple with the ways that we participate in racism writ large with the power.
Sure. So the first thing I like to say is that my favorite definition, which is also in the book, of racism is racism as a system of advantage, right? But let's talk about the prejudice part first, because when one person says to another, "You're racist," what they usually mean is that you are actively engaged in some behavior or some expressing some attitudes which indicate deeply held racist assumptions and ideas. And most people consider that to be nobody wants to be described as a racist, as you said. When someone says that, people feel, as has been reported to me, I once asked a teacher, how would she feel if a student said she was racist? And she said, I would feel like I've been punched in the stomach, that it's really hurtful and personally wounding to be labeled in that way. But I think part of what we have to understand is that racism is so deeply embedded in our society, not just in terms of individual attitudes and assumptions that people might make, but in terms of the policies and practices that our institutions are built on. The way our financial system works, the way education and employment opportunities are distributed, the way the criminal justice system operates, the way the reasons our neighborhoods are populated the way they are and have been historically. All of that has to do with power and policy, right? And so the idea that you have to be deeply personally prejudiced to participate in racism is actually erroneous. I like to describe it as being like racism in our society is being kind of like a moving walkway. Let me talk about the moving walkway for a moment, because I think that it might help. When we think about this moving walkway, imagine you're at the airport and you step onto that moving walkway that takes you from terminal A to terminal B. That's the Atlanta airport anyway. You are being carried along. That walkway was moving before you got there, right? And racism is like that. Racism has been embedded in our society long before any of us were born. But when we got there, we step onto that walkway and we are carried along because those policies, those practices, those procedures are in place, and the attitudes that support them are part of the air we breathe. I talk about that air as being like smog. Nobody wants to breathe smog, but we all do because it's the only air available. So we are breathing the smog and we're standing on that moving walkway and we're being carried along. There are people who step onto that moving walkway and walk fast. They want to get where it's going and they want to get there quickly. And we might think of those folks as actively racist. They are actively embracing the destination. They are actively embracing the assumptions that are fueling the racism in our society. There are other people who don't believe any of that stuff. They don't embrace it. They don't like it. They don't want to participate in it. They're just standing still. But they get carried along in the same way that the person walking fast does. They're headed to the same destination. They're just passive, right? So we might describe them as passively racist. Passively racist because they're still participating, but they're not actively, they might not even hold those beliefs and assumptions. But unless they're doing something to stop that moving walkway, they're colluding with it. So then there's some people who will say, I see the problem. I don't want to go where this is headed. I'm turning around. Imagine that, turning around on the moving walkway. Well, now you're just traveling backwards, right? You're still being carried along. You're just not looking where it's going. You can say, I don't see the problem because you're standing backwards, but you're still being carried along. You're still, in that sense, participating. It's only when you're actively walking in the opposite direction. It's only when you're actively taking action to interrupt the process that you can say you are working against racism. And that is where, if you read my book and you read Ibram Kendi's book, his definition is a little different than mine. You'll find some differences. But where we come together in agreement is that you can only be anti-racist if you're actively working against that system. And so for me, when people say, well, is this person racist or that person? And I get asked this question sometimes, particularly, if somebody famous has done something, problematic. Someone will say, well, do you think so-and-so is a racist? And I always say, to me, the most important question is not, is this person racist or that person racist? The most important question is, are they actively working against racism? And that's the question. That's the question we want to be able to say yes to.
I think that's very powerful. In your analogy, which I actually think that's a brilliant way of thinking about it, the moving walkway, and
Yes.
that you can benefit from the fact that you're going to eventually have some advantage of getting somewhere to point B without having to do anything. But if I can carry that analogy a little bit in terms of a community that might feel threatened, no one wants to feel like they're going backwards, right? And
Mm-hmm.
and you said that the person who has to fight it has to go backwards. And I think that there is a certain way that some people feel like, well, but the system's kind of working for me. So, and a question that I would ask is that, like, there's, I would argue that as people of faith and as Jews, you have to fight racism because it's the right thing to do. And because just in the same way that we know that anti-Semitism hurts our community and we know what that feels like, we can't expect to fight anti-Semitism on our own, and we need partners in that. And we would hope that good people would come and be with us in that fight, that we also have to be in this fight against racism. Not to mention that, of course, there are people of color within our own community as well. That being said, I also know human nature is such that oftentimes if it feels like it's going against your self-interest in some way, it can be hard to motivate. So if you can give us some sense of understanding, besides it being the right thing to do, which
Yes.
Our religious,
Mm-hmm.
I hope religious leaders everywhere will talk about this, and we will continue to, but from just even a place of self-interest, why do we need to change this system? Why would someone who's not being hurt by the system in some way, or actually, I think you'll argue that all of us are being hurt by the system. But
Yes.
tell us a little bit about why we need to all be in this fight.
Yeah, well, you have hit the nail on the head when you said what I would say, which is all of us are being hurt by the system. It is certainly true, and in my book, there's a paragraph where I say, I had a white male student in one of my psychology of racism classes. And at the end of the semester, he said, I've learned a lot. But one of the things I've learned is that the system is rigged in my favor. Why would I want that to change? Like, why, what's in it for me to see it different? But what I pointed out to him is that you're paying a price. As I said, there's no such thing as a free lunch. You are paying a price for the racism in our society. And what does that price look like? Let's look at just how our society functions. If we are incarcerating more people than the rest of the modern world, right? The cost of that incarceration, not just in lost productivity, but in the actual dollars spent, it's very expensive to put someone in prison and keep them there. And more expensive than sending them to college, where they could then, be educated and become a productive citizen. If we look at the cost of inequitable healthcare to high mortality rates, lower life expectancy, if we look at the ways in which education is not functioning equitably, the lost opportunities and productivity of young people, particularly as we see, I think about this sometimes, in the 50s, if 10% of the population was not being given access to high quality education and being limited in their ability to be contributing members of the society and, less productive than they might otherwise be because of racism. Okay, well, maybe somebody'd say, it's worth it to me to have the advantage I've got. But when you expand that population now to almost 50% of the population, then can we afford as a nation to have 50% of our population undereducated, underemployed, in poor health? As we are learning from this pandemic, my health impacts your health, right? We're all in this together. And so there's so many examples of the ways in which our society, U.S. society, is behind the progress of other nations, in part because of the dysfunction of the racism in our society.
So, an interesting question from Shelley, who says, but we have to acknowledge that power is a zero-sum game. So if people are okay about, giving up privilege in the kind of the theoretical, or if it's, maybe something that doesn't affect them, do you agree with that statement that it's a zero-sum game, and in some way giving power in other places is going to necessitate the giving up of power from that other 50%?
It kind of depends on how you think about power, right? Mm-hmm. So I'm gonna use an example. I was thinking about that, prejudice plus power definition, and the power in that definition. Let me just say a word about the definition. I like the definition racism as a system of advantage based on race, but another commonly used definition, which I do describe in the book, is prejudice plus power. And that power term speaks to social power. It's not necessarily positional power, as in, a leader of an organization, president of the United States. It's social power. And I was thinking of an example of it would be the incident that occurred in Central Park involving the white woman, Amy Cooper. When she decided to call the police and erroneously report that the Black bird watcher was attacking her, she was using her social power. She knew that she had the power to summon the police and that they would believe, a white woman in distress in the park and would come to her aid. That was an example of social power. Now, let's imagine she didn't have that social power in the way that she was using it. She didn't have that privilege. She was, the police were going to respond in the same way to her as they would to anybody else. That doesn't change the quality of her life in any meaningful way. It improves the quality of his life, right? That she's not able to do that to him. but it doesn't change the quality of hers. She, unfortunately, her behavior changed the quality of her life. She lost her job and some other things happened to her. But when we think about opportunity, if we think about a system of advantage giving more opportunity to one group over another, we could argue, well, there's only, there's a limited number of jobs. Why wouldn't I want to save the best jobs for people in my group? There's a limited number of,
Well, it's the way people respond about affirmative action. They see it as a zero-sum game in that way.
Yes,
right?
But they do.
Sorry.
No worries. And to a certain degree, they are correct in this sense. If there's only one CEO, if I get the CEO job, it means you didn't get it, right? That there is a certain truth to that. But at the same time, if I got the job because I actually had some skills and abilities that you didn't have, then hopefully the company is going to flourish because of my leadership in a way that will not only benefit me, but also benefit you, right? So if we assume that we want folks with talent to be able to rise and exercise that talent, we might have less mediocrity. And in that sense, we'd all benefit.
Great. So I think that, if you asked who wants to be anti-racist, we'd all raise our hands if you could see us. Mm-hmm. And yet that's a very hard thing to understand what it actually means. And yes. I think, there's the ways that maybe we could talk about some of those systems of privilege that we all participate in. If we send our children to a private school, we get special testing for, the SAT. If we have certain advantages that we know that we can actively participate in, it's hard to imagine that, one-on-one, I don't know if your advice would be, yes, each one of you should give up those privileges in order to change the system, or if it's more systemic work that we're doing, or is this about saying hello to people, or is it about being at protests? So I'm not asking that to be facetious. I really think
no, I understand. People do. Where do I start?
Struggling with what do we do?
Yeah.
Where do we?
The good news is there are many places to make change, right? So there's lots of opportunity. So when people ask me, what should I do next? One of the things I say is educate yourself, right? Learn more. Because when you know more about the history of the U.S. and what's happened, not just in 400 years ago, but, last week or 2 weeks ago, to the extent that we educate ourselves about policies and practices and the experiences that people are having, then we can make change within our spheres of influence. So I'm an educator. Let's imagine somebody's listening is a classroom teacher. You can go into your classroom and you can ask who in my classroom sees herself or himself represented. What are the pictures on the walls? What are the books on the shelves? Some kids will see themselves reinforced by the materials, the curriculum materials, will see themselves represented in the classroom, not only by the teacher, but by what they're learning. Other kids may never see themselves included in positive ways. And that is going to have a detrimental effect on their sense of self and belongingness in the classroom. So that sounds simple, but it's an important thing. So, a teacher can say, let me do an audit of my classroom materials and ask the question, who's included? Who's missing? What can I do about that? On a bigger scale, maybe you're the principal of the school. If you're the principal of the school, you can ask those questions, but you might also ask about disciplinary practices. Who's showing up in my office, being disciplined, being sent home for suspension? And is there a racial difference in that? Is there a disparity? Are Black kids more likely to be sent to the office, sent on suspension, sent, with various disciplinary interventions? The short answer is yes. In most schools, that data is yes, they are more likely. But when you disaggregate the data, what you find is that the offenses are not that different from what white kids are doing, but the response to the offenses is different. Even, let's talk about a shocking statistic, preschool suspension.
I didn't even know that was a thing.
I was just going to say, who gets suspended from preschool? Well, as it turns out, big Black boys get suspended from preschool. If you are a boy and you're African American and you're big for your age, you are much more likely to be kicked out of preschool than any other group of children. Not because necessarily you've done something wrong, but because you are perceived as threatening because of your size. And the stereotypes of young Black boys as potentially problems, potentially violent, turns a squabble on a playground in the sandbox into this kid's a problem. We need to control him. Mm. And it's shocking to read that data, but there's a lot of research to support that kind of differential treatment shows up very early. So there are lots of examples. But the question I would ask is, what's your sphere of influence? Are you a banker? Look at your lending policies. Who's being able to borrow money and who isn't? A lot of times we rely on algorithms, but those algorithms are based on often stereotypical assumptions that are cooked into them. There's so many examples of how to start. So I think for many people, the first question is, who do I influence and how? Where do I have an impact? And have I looked at the data about who's participating, who's not, who's missing from my picture?
Thank you. I want to make sure we get to some questions that people might be asking from Zoom, and I already have a couple here. And if anyone else out there wants to put one in, I invite you to do so, and Hilly will try to send a few my way so that I don't have to sort through them while I'm listening to and I know she somehow can multitask better. But here's one from Sophie. What's the best way to bring folks who don't want to talk about race, don't realize the privilege of whiteness, to the table to discuss or to confront the issue of racism in our country?
Well, sometimes this question comes from family members, right? Like maybe I want to have a conversation with a family member who's not receptive. Maybe we're all having dinner together and, I'm reading a book and I'd like my family member to read the book, and the family member's like, fake news, I'm not interested, whatever it might be. It's hard sometimes to bring people along who don't want to be brought along. But there is a strategy which I like to tell people about, and I call it the 3 F's. F, F, F. And what the 3 F's stand for is felt, found, and feel. So it goes something like this. Imagine you're sitting at the dinner table with that family member or a colleague, that person you're trying to get engaged. And you might say, there was a time when I felt that way. I felt like this didn't have anything to do with me. This was not an important topic. I wasn't interested. But then I found out how much of my life was being diminished by racism in our society, and how hurtful it was to other people, and how problematic it is for all of us. And so I now feel that I have to do what I can to educate myself so I might be able to be part of the solution rather than being part of the problem.
Felt, found, feel. That's very helpful. Not just talking about this, but lots of complicated and hard conversations.
Yes. And let me just say a word about why it works. Because you'll notice when I say those things, I felt this way, then I found this out, I now feel this way. You're never accusing the other person of anything. You're not saying you did this, you're wrong, you're this, you're that. It's all about, I've been on this journey. Here's what I felt, then I found this out, now I feel. And that person may follow along that narrative with you in a way that at least opens them up a little bit.
I just have to note that I'm just so grateful. First of all, it's so clear that you're an educator, like just in the way you approach everything, and you're teaching us so beautifully. But also, I just so appreciate the ability to have such a hard and complicated conversation in a way that you are masterful at, like, not in any way mincing words, but being able to do this in a way that it just diffuses, I think, some of the ways that this conversation can become so impossible for people to have. So both in what you teach and also the way you teach it is really
Well,
a model
thank you.
for all of us in having these kinds of conversations.
Thank you for that.
I think there are a couple, really important questions here. One is just sort of in terms of helping do some of the repair. What is your feeling on reparations?
Well, I think that
and what could that look like? Yeah.
Yeah. I think this is a big question, and I don't have a good answer in the sense that, do I think reparations is deserved? I do. If we look at the long history of not just individual behavior, but federally sanctioned governmental, and not just slavery. I mean, there's certainly the free labor, right? And the impact of that labor on the wealth of the country. But then the continued discrimination in terms of Jim Crow and, segregated policies, not just in terms of employment, but housing, sponsored by the federal government. There's, so much information about all of that that's available to us. You can certainly make the case without question. That said, how would it be distributed? I have heard some people talk about investing in organizations like historically Black colleges, like providing scholarships, thinking about how that should happen. I am encouraged by the fact that more and more people are talking about reparations. I live in Atlanta, and there is a bank in our region, which is, it's a regional bank. It's mostly serving in the Southeast. But that bank, I'll tell you the name of the bank, which is Truist, Truist. Truist is the bank that came together as a merger of two banks, SunTrust, which is a Southern regional bank, and BB&T, also a Southern regional bank. They merged. And when they merged, which was, that merger was about a year ago, when they merged, the president of BB&T became the president of Truist, and the president of SunTrust became the COO. I'm mentioning this simply to say that this summer, they put out a statement acknowledging that those banks had their roots in the business of enslavement, and that the original capital that came into that banking system came as the result of, the enslavement of people, and that the bank had a history of being part of that Jim Crow discrimination, and they wanted to own up to that history. And they don't use the R word. They don't talk about reparations, but they do talk about the things that they are going to do to increase investment in African American communities to try to repair some of the damage that they participated in. And I thought it was a public statement. It was discussed in the local paper. I thought it was very useful for a bank to say, we were a part of this. Some colleges and universities have said, we were a part of this. Georgetown University, as was reported in the New York Times, saved itself from bankruptcy by selling off some of the enslaved people it owned in the 1800s, and had to say, we have to own up to this. So I think that the conversation needs to continue. I know that there's a recent book out by an economist whose name is Sandy Darity, about reparations, which I have not yet read, but I'm eager to read it because I know it's a topic that he's been thinking about a long time, and I'd like to educate myself more about it.
Mm. Well, I think reparations is you obviously can't go back and repair lost lives and all those things, and yet it's biblical for us also that we reparations are basically in our Torah, that
Yes.
the way that we have interpreted for all time, an eye for an eye, life for life, has been that you make reparations in some financial way. And then after the Holocaust, not only were there individual reparations to Holocaust survivors, but an investment in the state of Israel from Germany as a form of reparations. So it's
Yes.
Certainly as a Jewish people have experienced and talked about this idea. It's not just a new idea, in case anyone was wondering, from my community. It's an ancient idea that that has been in our tradition as well. I mean, just speaking of that, I think I have a question here about how you might see that anti-Semitism or homophobic or anti-gay behavior is different than racism.
I don't know that it is. I mean, I think what I mean by that is, any ism can kill you, right? And so if we think about isms as a category, by isms, I mean racism, heterosexism, anti-Semitism, ableism, these ageism, these isms basically dehumanize people. And anytime someone is being dehumanized, you make them vulnerable to violence. You make them vulnerable to lethal discrimination. So, I don't think we have to get into oppression Olympics in the sense that, and I say this in my book, any one of these isms can kill you. They're all bad. The focus on racism is the focus of my writing, but it's not because it's the only ism. And they intersect, as we know. The experience of racism by someone who is also gay is going to be different than the experience of racism by someone who identifies as heterosexual. Someone who is someone who is vulnerable to racism because of their racial group membership and also is Jewish. They will also perhaps be a target of anti-Semitism, or someone, you get what I'm saying. The intersectionality of these identities needs to be acknowledged. We all have multiple identities. I used to say this in my classes to my students. We all have multiple identities. If you ask me to describe myself, I will describe myself as Black. I'll describe myself as a woman. I'm probably less likely to say I'm able-bodied, though I am, right?
Right.
We tend to lift up those identities that we feel around which we have focused our attention because of our social context. But we all have multiple identities, and some of those are dominant identities. As a heterosexual, that's a dominant identity that I have. But some of them are targeted identities. And we usually pay more attention to the targeted identity than our dominant identity.
That is so true. There are a number of questions that I'm going to try to see if I can, because they're all in relationship with, it's all about relationships. And in terms of kind of, one is just sort of like hopelessly not willing to face racism, in-laws, or a friend who's not willing to engage. Is it ethical to remain in relationship and in friendship with someone that you think is holding these views that you find really abhorrent? I guess in the case of in-laws, you probably can't just decide you're not going to have them as your in-laws anymore. So it's a little bit harder. But and then in terms of the other side of, like, if you're seeking out to build more relationships across this line of difference, because as we know, the Black kids still are sitting separately at the cafeteria, and in metaphorically for adults as well. How do we begin? What do we do about the problematic relationships, and how do we build the relationships we're also seeking?
Yes, let's start with the ones we're seeking.
Okay.
So because in some ways that's the easier question, though not easy always. But for many people, the workplace is a place where they make friends with people whose backgrounds is different from their own, right? If we consider that neighborhoods are segregated and schools are segregated, It is often the workplace where we have the opportunity to engage with people whose background is different from ourselves. And so then the question is, how do we deepen those relationships? I live in Atlanta, as I mentioned, and in my book, at the very end of the 2017 edition and the epilogue, I talk about something called the Atlanta Friendship Initiative. This was started by a white man who was concerned about racism as a barrier to progress and in the city and wanted to do something about it. And he did it by reaching out to a Black man that he knew casually. They were both business people. They'd, been in the same meetings, but weren't friends per se. But he asked that person to have coffee with him. And he said, I'm trying to build bridges across communities, and I would like to start by getting to know you better. Is that something that you'd be open to? And he replied, yes, I'm willing to do that. And they started meeting regularly and became fast friends and launched what they call the Atlanta Friendship Initiative, where they reached out to community leaders and matched them up with people who were racially or religiously or in some other significant way different from themselves, and the task was to meet at least quarterly for lunch or breakfast or something like that. And then once a year, your family and that person's family get together. If you signed up, that's what you agreed to do. This has turned out to be a very successful effort from the point of view of people developing friendships with folks that they might not otherwise have spent time with or even ever really talked to. So deepening your social network with some intentionality is one way to do it. And of course, the other person has to be willing, but if you are open to that possibility, it certainly can happen. And then there are, of course, organizations that are structured specifically for that. Book clubs that are social justice book clubs, or organizations that are really focused on building bridges. And so putting yourself in the space where you can volunteer for for an organization that might have a diverse group of volunteers, as an example, finding common ground in that way. As for the people who, you don't really want to stay in a relationship with, but you have to, you can try the 3F method and to say this, let's imagine there's an in-law who just won't stop using offensive language, and you've got kids and you don't want your kids to hear that language. You can, say, I felt that way. I found out. Now I feel. But in the end, you might have to say, I found out that it's harder to get rid of these ideas once you've been exposed to them than it is to prevent the ideas in the first place. I am really concerned that I don't want my children to hear these kinds of comments. So I hope that we can at least agree that when we're here, you'll refrain from using that language.
Well, I wish I had you in my ear every time I had a hard conversation to have. That's very beautiful and great advice. I have so many other questions that I want to ask and that people want to ask, and we have literally, I guess now no minutes, but I want us to end on a note of hope. Can you just tell us, maybe very quickly, what gives you a sense of hopefulness in this time?
Well, let me just say, when I see long lines of people getting ready to vote, which you see in Georgia, sadly, on the one hand, you could say that's discouraging. Why are the lines so long? Is that voter suppression? But the fact that people are getting in line and staying in line and really exercising their democratic right to vote is encouraging to me. But I also remind myself of something that Brian Stevenson says, he's the head of the Equal Justice Initiative, wrote the book Just Mercy. He says, injustice prevails where hopelessness persists. I'm going to repeat that. Injustice prevails where hopelessness persists. So I think of being hopeful as a responsibility that as I like to say,
it's mandate even.
Yes, it's a discipline. You get up every morning and you look for signs of hope. Maybe it's in a small story you hear on NPR. Maybe it's in something you read. Maybe it's in, a yard sign you see in somebody's yard. But there are signs all around us. We just have to look for them and lift them up when we find them.
Wow, what a beautiful place to end, and something that each one of us can seek to do every day. And to think of that in terms of helping fight injustice, not just making ourselves feel better, but literally being a tool for fighting injustice is a very powerful way to think about what hope means for us. And I find this conversation hopeful. I find it hopeful that we had, 100 people joining us from Central.
Yes.
To be engaged in this conversation. I'm grateful to all of you for joining us. Thank you so much for coming. And to be continued. If you haven't read Dr. Tatum's book, I actually find it to be just as she was tonight. So intelligent, thoughtful, and with really practical ways of thinking about these really challenging questions. And there's a reason it was a bestseller then, and then it still came back and was a bestseller again, because it really is, in a way that I think speaks in a language that we can really take in some of the hard stuff. And that's the way I felt when I was reading it. So I encourage people to read it if they haven't. And then maybe get in a book club with people who are different than you and talk about it. So among the many things we can do, I want to thank Rabbi Hilly Haber again also, and the adult engagement team for setting up this powerful conversation. And Dr. Tatum, to you for not just for this talk, but really for the work that you have spent your life doing. And we hope to be in it with you.
Well, thank you so much. And this is a hopeful conversation. So thank you. Oh,
and thank you. And I want to just mention that we have our next talk back session around race. There's one is October 27th at 7 p.m. That's actually next week. It's very, very soon. Hilly, did you, or Nicole, did one of you, or Laura, any one of you want to say just a word and remind everyone what it is?
Sure. We'll actually be having a community. No, thank you. I'm wonderful. I feel so helpful right now. And we'll have kind of an opportunity next week to just come together as a community to talk about the different things we've been reading, to reflect on this wonderful conversation we've just heard, and really together as a community to figure out ways of maintaining that hope, sustaining that hope, and using that hope as a force of justice.
Beautiful. So I hope that people do that, because I know one of the frustrating things is we all had so much more that we wanted to continue to talk about. So we're giving you the opportunity next week. So please join. And of course, we're all going to go vote. Some of that early voting begins this weekend in New York. So I encourage people to do that as well. And thank you everyone for joining. Have a wonderful night. Bye-bye.
Goodbye.